The American generals observing the Normandy invasion from command ships offshore and from headquarters in England had developed certain expectations about how different Allied national forces would perform during the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. Expectations shaped partly by experience fighting alongside those forces in previous campaigns, and partly by stereotypes and assumptions that reflected national prejudices more than objective assessment. The British Army was expected to be professional and methodical, perhaps overly cautious given Montgomery's reputation, but reliable and well-organized. American forces were seen by American commanders as aggressive and adaptable, though perhaps lacking the experience that British forces had accumulated through years of war. But Canadian forces occupied an ambiguous position in American military thinking. They were Commonwealth troops operating under British command, yet they were North American soldiers who might be expected to fight more like Americans than like British regulars, creating uncertainty about what their combat performance would actually demonstrate. The Canadian forces assigned to D-Day had their own complex history that American observers often didn't fully appreciate. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade that would assault Juno Beach had been training in Britain for years, building unit cohesion and tactical proficiency while waiting for the invasion that would finally employ them in combat. Many Canadian soldiers had not seen action since the disastrous Dieppe raid in 1942, an operation that had cost Canadian forces terrible casualties and that had created lingering questions about Canadian combat effectiveness. Some American officers aware of Dieppe's failure wondered whether Canadian forces had the aggressive mindset and tactical flexibility that amphibious operations demanded. Others, noting that Canadian units in Italy had performed well in difficult fighting, expected the D-Day Canadians to acquit themselves honorably, even if they didn't match the legendary toughness of British airborne forces or the aggressive initiative of American Rangers. What American commanders actually witnessed during the D-Day landings would challenge many of these preconceptions and would create assessments that ranged from grudging respect to genuine admiration, depending on which American general was making the judgment and what aspects of Canadian performance they were evaluating. The initial landings on Juno Beach encountered conditions that were as difficult as or worse than those at Omaha Beach, where American forces suffered their heaviest D-Day casualties. Juno's beach obstacles were more extensive than expected, surf conditions made landing craft control difficult, and German defensive positions remained largely intact despite preliminary bombardment. Canadian assault troops hit the beach facing withering fire from concrete bunkers and prepared positions, taking casualties before they could even reach cover, confronting exactly the kind of opposed landing that military planners feared most. The first American observers to comment on Canadian performance were naval officers whose ships supported the Juno Beach landings and who could watch the assault develop through binoculars and ship-mounted optics. These officers, accustomed to the chaos and horror of amphibious operations from previous landings in the Mediterranean and Pacific, noted that Canadian troops advanced off the beaches with remarkable speed despite heavy casualties, that they didn't freeze or go to ground under fire but rather pushed forward to engage German positions, that their tactics showed sophistication in how they used cover and supporting fire to reduce strong points. One American naval captain, whose destroyer provided close fire support for Canadian forces, reported to his superiors that the Canadians were fighting like demons, a phrase that captured both the intensity of their combat and the surprise American observers felt at witnessing it. General Omar Bradley, commanding American ground forces for D-Day, received reports about Canadian progress throughout June 6th and in the days immediately following. Bradley's initial reaction, documented in his war diary and later memoir, was cautious acknowledgement that Canadian forces had accomplished their D-Day objectives despite facing significant resistance, but without the kind of effusive praise he reserved for American units that he felt had performed exceptionally. Bradley's assessment reflected partly genuine evaluation of tactical performance and partly the competitive dynamic among Allied commanders, where praising other nations' forces too enthusiastically might reflect poorly on American units by comparison. Yet even Bradley's measured comments noted that Canadians had penetrated further inland on D-Day than any other Allied forces except for some airborne units, achieving a lodgment that provided operational opportunities for exploitation. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander with responsibility for managing relationships among American, British, and Canadian forces, was more diplomatically generous in his assessments of Canadian D-Day performance. Eisenhower understood that maintaining Allied cohesion required acknowledging each nation's contributions, and that Canadian public opinion and government support for the war effort depended partly on recognition that Canadian forces were making significant sacrifices and achieving important results. His public statements praised Canadian aggressiveness and tactical success on Juno Beach, noting that they had overcome formidable defenses and had established positions that contributed materially to D-Day's overall success. Whether Eisenhower's private assessments matched his public praise remained unclear, but his role required balancing genuine military evaluation with the political and diplomatic considerations that shaped Allied cooperation. The most revealing American assessments of Canadian combat performance came not from the highest-ranking generals, but rather from mid-level American officers who worked alongside Canadian units in the weeks following D-Day, coordinating operations along the seam between American and British-Canadian sectors of the Normandy lodgment. These officers, less constrained by diplomatic considerations and more focused on tactical effectiveness, provided evaluations that were often brutally honest about both strengths and weaknesses they observed. American liaison officers with Canadian units reported that Canadian infantry showed excellent small unit tactics and aggressive leadership at the junior officer and NCO levels, that they adapted quickly to the bocage fighting that characterized Normandy's terrain, and that they maintained unit cohesion and fighting spirit despite taking heavy casualties in the grinding attritional combat that dominated the campaign. But these same liaison officers also noted areas where Canadian forces struggled, observations that American generals received through intelligence summaries and after-action reports. Canadian armored tactics were sometimes criticized as overly cautious, with tank units hesitant to exploit breakthroughs or to take risks that American commanders felt were justified by tactical opportunities. Canadian artillery, while professionally competent, sometimes lacked the flexibility and responsiveness that American forces had developed through their experience in North Africa and Italy. Some American observers felt that Canadian units operated too rigidly within British doctrinal frameworks, lacking the improvisational initiative that American military culture encouraged. These criticisms weren't universal. Other American officers praised Canadian combined arms coordination and their systematic approach to reducing German defensive positions, but they suggested that American assessments of Canadian performance were nuanced rather than uniformly positive. The specific incident that would crystallize American generals' views on Canadian fighting quality occurred during the Battle for Caen, in the weeks following D-Day, when Canadian forces participated in Operation Charnwood, a major attack designed to capture the city that had been a D-Day objective, but that had remained in German hands despite weeks of fighting. American commanders watched this operation with particular interest because it involved the kind of deliberate urban combat that American forces would face later in the campaign, and because it tested whether Canadian forces could conduct successful offensive operations against determined German resistance rather than simply holding defensive positions. The fighting for Caen was brutal, with Canadian units taking heavy casualties while making slow but steady progress against German SS Panzer divisions that defended the city with fanatical determination. General George Patton, never diplomatic in his assessments and always competitive about American military prowess, commented privately that the Canadian performance at Caen showed courage but lacked the aggressive exploitation of success that he felt American forces would have achieved. Patton's criticism reflected his personal command style, which emphasized rapid exploitation and armored breakthrough, and may not have fairly acknowledged that Canadian forces were fighting in a constrained urban environment where Patton's preferred tactics weren't feasible. Yet his comments, shared with other American generals and recorded in his diary, influenced how some American commanders viewed Canadian tactical capabilities and reinforced stereotypes about British Commonwealth forces being methodical rather than aggressive. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st U.S. Army and responsible for coordinating with adjacent British-Canadian forces, provided more measured assessments that acknowledged both Canadian strengths and the difficult circumstances they faced. Hodges noted in reports to Bradley and Eisenhower that Canadian units were fighting in some of Normandy's most heavily defended sectors, facing elite German formations that American forces in other sectors weren't encountering, and that judging Canadian performance required understanding the operational context rather than simply comparing casualty ratios or territorial gains. Hodges's comments suggested respect for Canadian fighting quality, even while noting differences in tactical approach and doctrine that sometimes complicated coordination between American and Canadian forces. The assessments that American generals developed about Canadian combat performance during and after D-Day reflected a complex mixture of genuine military evaluation, national prejudices, competitive dynamics among Allied commanders, and the practical need to maintain coalition cohesion while prosecuting a difficult campaign. Most American generals ultimately concluded that Canadian forces were professionally competent, that they fought courageously under difficult conditions, and that they contributed materially to D-Day's success and to the subsequent Normandy campaign. Yet few American commanders placed Canadian units in the same category as the elite British airborne forces or the most highly regarded American divisions, suggesting that Canadian military reputation, at least among American observers, remained somewhat ambiguous despite D-Day's demonstrated combat effectiveness. For Canadian commanders and soldiers, American generals' assessments mattered less than their own sense of having accomplished difficult missions under fire and having vindicated the years of training and preparation that had preceded D-Day. Canadian forces had proven they could conduct successful amphibious operations against determined opposition, could advance inland faster than planning assumptions had projected, and could maintain offensive operations despite casualties that would have broken less.